Hello and welcome to another episode of Blueprint. I'm John Hubbard. Today we explore one question I've been obsessed with lately, and that is, what does a SOC look like now that we're in a world of vibe coding, agentic AI, model context protocol, and agent-to-agent communication? What SOCs look like today is already massively changed from what it was just a few years ago, and that change is about to accelerate. These technologies are bringing some obvious benefits, but also some potential dangers and considerations we need to be mindful of. It's an interesting new world of possibility, and no one is quite sure where the endpoint is yet, but that's what makes it so exciting. In this interview, we take a deep look at what the SOC analyst role of the future is going to look like, how AI will summarize the posture of the SOC at any moment with the push of a button, how important contextual data will be gathered for you, and most excitingly, how automation can be intelligently built on the fly instead of hard-coded into static steps. This is one of those interviews that was so much fun, from all the ideas just flying back and forth and amazing potential these AI-powered capabilities are already bringing into the SOC experience. My guest for this episode, James Spiteri, brings a wealth of knowledge and hands-on experience to this topic, and throughout this interview gives us his insider's perspective on what's possible today and what lies just around the corner. So grab a seat and let's explore how some of the most recent advancements in AI continue to reshape the future of security operations. This is Blueprint. James, could you give us an intro to yourself and your background and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm James. I lead our product initiatives at Elastic for what we do with generative AI and machine learning, specifically in Elastic security. Coming up to 7 years at Elastic now, which is pretty crazy. And my background is entirely technical security operations, digital defense, that sort of thing. So I've been doing, for lack of a better term, cyber analytics work pretty much my entire career. And now I get to build tools for cyber analysts to use, which is very exciting for me.
We're in an exciting time right now for SOC analysts and tech tools because generative AI, right? The hot topic. I don't know, were you at RSA this year? I think you were, right?
I was.
How many times did you hear the word AI approximately? In the millions?
It's probably easier to say when I didn't hear it. Yeah, it's everywhere. It's finally, I think we've come to a point where people are realizing it's a must to embrace it just because of how much easier it's going to make their lives, especially, compared to even RSA last year. People thought it was being thrown in their face everywhere, but compared to this year, it's like night and day.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
It's definitely everywhere.
So working for Elastic and working kind of on the technical tools used by people in a SOC, there's, in my mind, just so many opportunities there. How should someone who's looking at all this hype start to approach the question of where do I even begin here? What kind of opportunities are you seeing for the SOC with Gen AI, or maybe specific stuff that you're at least working on? Because obviously there's a ton of opportunities, but
yeah.
Where do you start with this?
Yeah, I'll tell you a bit about how we started thinking about it before we even built anything. When we first got our hands on this technology, started playing around with LLMs, first question that came to my mind is this going to allow us to build stuff that we've never been able to build in our industry before? And more specifically, can it take away some of the more annoying, mundane tasks that our customers have to do? Or, that cyber analysts have to do on their day-to-day. So that's kind of how we started to think about it. And the first and probably most common way people think about this is, this is something I can chat with. This is something I can converse with in natural language, which is absolutely true, right? That's probably the first interface we've had with tools like ChatGPT and whatever, Claude, Gemini, and others. So we started to tinker with that first. And what we found really quickly is how helpful it is, even with tasks like incident or alert investigation and remediation. Even just starting from, and in fact, this is what we started with 2 years ago. We allowed you to grab something like fields in an alert table or a JSON object or whatever, and just ask an LLM to break it down for you in a way which is easier to understand. And for some people that might seem, isn't that really simple? But if you think about it, it's simple but really powerful, because we've been kind of trained to waste cycles and energy to look for key value pairs in a table, right? Or something like a JSON blob or whatever. But now you grab that and you make it into very simplistic terms. So like, hey, you're looking at an event where this process was executed, it had a parent process of this, it ended up spawning something else, which when you think about it, like that's so much easier for your brain to comprehend, right? You could be as technical as you want. You could be a beginner or whatever. It's just so much easier for you to understand without having to know all the intricacies about how your vendor is logging this or how you're supposed to interpret this in a table or a chart. So that was kind of the first thing we realized, hey, this is really helpful, like even just these simple situations. And that's kind of what we did with our assistant to start very early on, where send it a bit of context and just help me understand it a bit better, and maybe help me understand like what are some traditional follow-up activities that a security analyst might take here. We also found out really early on that because of how rich our cyber community is and how rich the content is out there about cyber in general. You have things like the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which is totally open. You have a lot of vendors putting out content in the open. You have all these threat intelligence findings. These large language models know a lot about cyber, right? Which is awesome. So like you can ask them questions, and for the most part, they'll be able to give you a really good, accurate answer about what typically should happen next. So that's kind of how the first entry we had, and like something our users really appreciated. And everyone, not just us, like you ask anyone, like you put this in front of anyone from a technical experienced analyst to a CISO to a beginner, they can now comprehend what's actually happening without having to know all the intricacies of the platform they're using. I remember getting on a call like a month after we released our assistant with one of our customers, and they had their technical guy on there, they had their CISO on the call, and the technical guy was still a bit skeptic. He said, oh, but I can look at this event and immediately know what's going on. And his CISO jumped in and said, you can, I can't, but now because it's in English, I can. And this is going to allow me to get even more value from this thing that I'm paying for. And then just following up from that, even if we take a step further, so putting this fairly simplistic concept of even just helping you understand events and alerts and that sort of thing. But sometimes we forget like the context of when something is presented to us. So let's take a situation, an alert is triggered for living off the land binary, right? Not everyone knows these things are living off the land binary. So you see something like certutil.exe or pick whatever favorite binary. If this is a newcomer to the industry, they might not know what that is. And if you tried to Google that process name, what's going to happen? You're going to get all the fake ads of fixed certutil errors, and that it'll probably take you hours to find an exact reason why certutil might be actually used in a security alert. But when you ask a large language model in the context of the alert you're investigating, it knows exactly why you've asked that question. So you eliminate all the burden of having to know how to search for like a living off the land process. So even stuff like that, it became really evident, oh, this is going to be so helpful for streamlining these kind of events where we've kind of been trained, look at the table, understand key value pairs, and then make your assumptions from there. So that kind of burden goes away now. So that was like the first very obvious thing we found out, and that's kind of the first thing we put into the product. And from there, it kind of escalated really quickly in a good way, because you go from that to being able to ask about what other events might be happening. So bringing the concept of asking instead of just one singular alert or event to, hey, okay, you're telling me about this case here, this event, this whatever alert you might call it. Do I have anything else in my alert queue which might be related to this one, as an example? So you now broaden the conversation to use a large language model to help you start to stitch things together. We found that with the right guidance, these models are very good at doing that, even though they're not trained specifically on like cyber incidents or whatever, but they're able to put and stitch together data points very effectively. So when we started to see users do more of that, like use our assistant to start off maybe asking about one alert, but then asking it like, hey, tell me what else might be related. We're like, you know what, this probably warrants its own like interface. And we started to then tinker with and come up with solutions within specifically Elastic Security where they're not chat-based, but they still use large language models. So we created this feature just about a year ago, something called Attack Discovery, where we do just that. Instead of you having to ask about stuff, we allow you to, with one button, just have a large language model with very specific instructions, figure out what might be going on within all your alerts. So you don't have to necessarily start from somewhere. And that was the first feature we put out where we were using large language models, but it wasn't chat-based. And I'm sure you know, John, like we've been trying to do this in the industry forever.
Yes.
Take me from a whole list of hundreds of alerts to just tell me what the heck is going on, right? And that's kind of what we've been trying to do with attack discovery, and we've seen really tremendous success. It took us a while to get it where we're very comfortable with kind of the results and how it displays them. But now we have this tool, this feature where it gives you this situational, attacks that are happening, but it feels very analyst friendly, right? Presents things to you in a way where, oh, I know how to deal with this inside of my SIM or whatever. I'm not necessarily having to chat and prompt for every step of the way because it does so much work for you. And then we kept on spiraling from there. Like we have now features that use large language models to do what I would like to call more engineering tasks versus operational tasks. So like we found really quickly that like large language models are really good at generating parsers and integrations. So we have this whole workflow now where you give us a bit of sample data, we'll actually create a whole what we call elastic agent integration for you, which is excellent, right? You've used Elastic in the past. I don't know if you still use it, but you know what it means to write like a field mapping or a parser or an ingest pipeline.
Yeah, lockstep configs and stuff like that.
Nobody wants to spend their precious time doing anything like that. Very mundane, very boring. So we built out like features with the large language models to do that. And more recently, literally like a few weeks ago, we started to apply this concept to like query conversion. So very common within our industry that you change platforms time and again. You might use one SIM, you might use another, you might use things like Sigma rules, whatever, and you probably build this really rich repository of content. But then what happens is you start to use a product where they have their own specific query languages and stuff, and all your old, very nice, rich repository of existing queries for other platforms is very hard to use. Which either means you have to convert everything, use some like open source conversion platform or something like that, which those do a fairly good job. But the problem with them is they don't have context into your environment. So typically what happens is when you try to use them, they don't necessarily generate the right fields within the queries to use and stuff like that. So we actually built out an area within the product where you can grab existing queries from something like pick whatever vendor. We started with one vendor for now. And we'll do the conversion for you. We'll tell you why we converted something the way we did. And then if you're happy with it, you can just apply it as an elastic detection, for example. So moving beyond, again, just using models in the operational use case, but also for the engineering use case. That's kind of some of the stuff we've done, because there's even more. But It's just really good to see. Like the way I like to think about it is, if we find something is like boring for a user to do, can we use an LLM to make it more fun? If something is particularly complex, can we use an LLM to make it simpler? And if something is particularly time consuming, can we use an LLM to do it quicker? And that's kind of the three things I use when thinking about like, okay, what's next in the product land here.
Yeah. Back to the thing you said right at the start of that, it's opening up a world of things that haven't been available to automate before, or to tie in and kind of integrate all the data and make sense of it in a push button kind of way, like you said, right? And so those are a ton of amazing use cases right off the bat. One question that came up in my mind as you were saying those things is like, for correlating data across alerts, right? Simple kind of thing you had mentioned at the start was one of your first use cases. When you do that sort of thing, how much is getting a successful answer that is useful out of that dependent upon grabbing a bunch of other context from your specific environment and loading that in, whether that's retrieval augmented generation or something else? Is that the thing that is making it work? And how much detail is actually needed from the greater environmental context to make that function well?
Yeah, great question. I think it's more about the metadata within the alert content itself versus additional context from the environment, which is also important, by the way. But, within alerts, there's so much rich, and this is why we started with alerts, by the way, which is raw events. There's so much additional context within them. You get things like MITRE attack techniques. You get things like, if it's a process-related event, hopefully you get the parent process, you get the child process, you get all that information, you get process ID. And that is what an LLM is really good at leveraging to get to its answer. And say, well, it looks at things like timestamps and it identifies, hey, okay, we're seeing some similarity in these events because James at this particular time did this. Coincidentally, there was a parent process of Excel followed by something else, and then it's able to stitch that story together. You have to find the right balance though, because then too much context might make it go awry. So like sometimes you might have too much metadata on this alert. So you have to be a bit more selective about what it can use and what it should use. Where additional context comes into play is things like asset criticality information for your users or hosts or whatever it may be, because then it can help prioritize the influence of what it would find first. And that's kind of this whole concept. What we really wanted to do is help you identify where your time as an analyst should be focused on first. Because that's usually the challenge with a long list of alerts. You might have, I don't know, let's pick a relatively median number, 100 alerts, right? There's situations where we have way more, sometimes there's less. Even if you start going through those and you've done your filtering, you've done your organization, you don't know if the alert you've just spent 20 minutes on warranted that 20 minutes. You know what I mean? There might be the next alert in line, which has impacted your business way more than that 20 minutes you just spent on. And that is where we really wanted to help attack discovery focus. Like, even if it spots like, hey, look, these are the 2 attacks that are important. There's some other stuff going on, but it can wait because like it's might be benign, it might not. But what we've seen in these attacks, you 100% want to focus your time on here first. And that is where we find the true value in this. And there's always still going to need to be, in my very humble opinion, a human validating that. We, especially at Elastic, we don't really believe we're in the business of replacing humans. We want to make them better. And this is kind of one of those processes where it's really shone through. Like you can really tell, even if it gets 95% of it right, or even 90 or a slightly lower percentage, it's still way more efficient than if you had to do all of that manually. So I answered in a bit more detail, but long story short, the alerts themselves usually have enough context and metadata to help stitch the story together. Adding additional context like your asset or entity information, like what hosts will impact my business more if they're compromised, that is really where it's going to help it, and then really prioritize like the actual attacks it should show you versus anything else.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect answer, because what I was thinking kind of in my head as you were saying that, and as I was asking that question is, one of the more important things is looking at those business critical workflows and systems and saying like, hey, there's a laptop over here that's compromised, but the real risk might be that laptop has a user that has access to the super important thing over here, and they're logged in with an account that can get to the critical data, right? And so if you're pulling in that additional information, that's something that is really hard to read into, especially as a new analyst, and even make that connection. So that's really cool that's one of the things, and that's what you're seeing people be able to get help with.
Definitely. And you think of like MSSPs, people who deal with not just their own, like the context of one customer or another. They might be servicing 1,000 customers. And then it becomes even harder for them if they had to manually know, hey, for this customer we're working with, this is the impactful host for them versus this. Like when you apply that at scale, when you deal with so many different individual use cases, it becomes even more powerful. In fact, I would say out of the top 10 users of all our AI features, like 60% of them are MSSPs because of like the value they see there.
Yeah, that's not surprising. I mean, one of the things I always hear from people in class who work at MSSPs is like, I want to do the best job I can, but I don't always have all the context. Yeah. And I'm also working with 20 different companies or whatever. So even if you have the info in theory, like applying that information is very difficult. So that's an incredible use case for this sort of thing, is kind of being that hive mind of all that info and applying it and giving it to someone all packaged up nice and neat so that they can make the best choices. And that's really the other thing you said, right? That it's all about, if you're faced with 100 alerts, how do you know what the best one is? Well, traditionally, it's like you got to tag everything, you got to make sure it's perfect. But even then, it's easy to miss stuff. So with that much more ability to pull in context and actually, I don't know if the word think is appropriate here, but apply some more kind of thought to it of sorts. Yeah, that's really probably upping the game. Is there any like hard numbers or feedback or metrics that you've been able to tie to like when people start using this? How much of an improvement that it's giving them, or is it more kind of objective, people just ranting and raving about it?
It is objective, but we do have some hard numbers as well. So it was fascinating for us to see one of our MSSP partners, they published unsolicited, they did an internal study where they grabbed, I think it was 6 or 10 analysts, something like that, and they compared their performance and like how quickly they were able to investigate and remediate incidents with our AI features versus without. And what they found across the board is like a 34% performance gain.
Wow.
And like a huge reduction in time. So they were able to do that, close it, move on to the next thing, close it. And that was phenomenal. Like literally they sent us a table, like analyst 1, analyst 2, time with AI, time without AI, performance gain. And then for them, obviously that means, oh, if my analysts are spending less time on each incident, that means I could have them be more efficient with their time. And even like they calculated cost savings in terms of human time as well. That was amazing. The customer's proficio, and I can say it because they published everything publicly. They wrote their own blog about it. It was just phenomenal to see. They were the ones who did it publicly. There are others who have done similar studies of our customers, but just the fact they went and did that and just came to us and said, "Hey, thanks, guys. This is the kind of what we're finding." And that really like just was mind blowing for me to see. Like we knew obviously because even our own InfoSec team is using these features, but yeah, it's just incredible validation from my side. And then of course you do get the people who try it and just openly rave about it, but having those hard factual numbers are just it's just amazing to see.
Yeah, that's a fantastic answer to that. We'll have to get that link and put it in the show notes for everyone so they can
definitely
check it out. So I guess one kind of follow-on question to that, and I don't know if you know the answer to this from the data that they published, but did they do the test where it was like a bunch of analysts that are working the exact same alerts? So like team A, team B, and they fed them the same thing?
I think they had the same 6 analysts or 6 or 10, I can't remember the exact number, go through the same alert set.
Okay.
So they wanted to be as fair as possible.
Right.
I think the difference between the analysts was levels, if I'm not mistaken. Just to see how much more value is this providing for someone who's very tenured versus someone starting out. So that was really interesting to see as well, because there's a bit of a misconception that for tenured people, this isn't as useful. It's still extremely useful because both for like the attack discovery side, but even the assistance side, putting things like triage and investigation just on the side for a bit. Let's take a detection engineer, right? A detection engineer, they can write threat hunting queries or detections like no tomorrow. You know what no experienced, seasoned detection engineer wants to do? They don't want to comment their queries or spend hours commenting their work.
Yep.
You put that into something like an assistant, which is fully aware of the queries that you've written, have it do the comments for you. Like, why would you spend your time doing it? So even for things like that, where, again, more of a day-to-day engineering thing versus operational, I can build a query in 5 minutes, but I don't want to spend an hour commenting it. So even if you just take that angle on it, it's so beneficial for like those seasoned detection engineers, you know?
Yeah. And that's a perfect segue to something I wanted to get into here is, as you said, like a lot of people might look at this and say like, yeah, I can obviously see how it's going to help a newcomer, but what are the L2 and L3 analysts doing with it in terms of helping find things that might not find, right? Like commenting, that's one thing. And that's one category of like, I just don't want to do this. But is it helping them also maybe find things that they wouldn't find even at that higher level? And if so, what have you seen done in that realm?
Yeah, and for there, I would say you could be as seasoned as you want, but you're not going to have all the context you need available to you in the back of your head for doing investigations. I'll give you an example, and this is where I think you mentioned it very briefly before. We have this concept of retrieval augmented generation. It's a very fancy term for cleverly supplying additional information to these models based off of what you might be investigating or doing through your day-to-day. So let's take a situation where you have a tier 3 analyst. They've been sent something they need to deal with. They've gone pretty far down the path of what might have happened in this case. Like they were able to get to a lot by themselves. But let's say now they're in a situation where they've identified that data was exfiltrated to somewhere. They've identified the IP or URL or whatever. You know what this very seasoned analyst probably doesn't know at the back of their head is which one of our firewall ACLs would have allowed this traffic out to be exit, for example. So now, what would need to happen in a world before these concepts in AI, right? They would have to either be very friendly with their firewall engineer, give them a call, Slack them, say, hey, do you know anything about this like egress point or whatever? Can you help me figure out where this lives in our infrastructure? Or maybe they have some wiki somewhere or CMDB where they have to go figure this out. Now they can just ask the question, because if you provide your firewall configs as knowledge with this concept of retrieval augmented generation or whatever you want to provide, you simply ask, hey, which rule would have allowed this egress traffic that I've identified here? That's it. That's all you need to ask now. So even for someone, that's where I've seen this stuff really play nicely with people who are, more experienced, more tenured, and they know exactly what to look for, how to look for it, but they don't have the full context of their organization just because there's too much context. Like, it's inhumanly possible for you to be aware of all your VPCs and network stuff and stuff like that. So that's where I've seen it provide the most impactful value for these kind of team members.
Yeah, that's really cool. And that's, one of a million examples of moments where I'm like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Why haven't I,
yeah,
why didn't I think of that? Right. That's the thing with these capabilities. It's like, it's so capable. The problem is just being creative enough to come up with all the good ideas you can implement with it. But yeah, of course, right? Like feed in assuming you can do it securely and you aren't worried about someone abusing that, right? Like feed in your configs, feed in all your information. And then this is going to be able to say, on top of what happened, why did it happen? And then build that into an incident report and lessons learned and maybe actions that need to be taken to make sure it never happens again. Really, really cool stuff there.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, like the nice thing as well is depending on how you, like whatever tool you're using or product, depending on how they've architected this, they can implement a feedback loop. So let's say, again, very seasoned, very experienced analyst found something. They did it manually, sure. But now they want to make the rest of the team aware, and they want to make this knowledge available to everyone. And traditionally, that would mean you document your findings, whatever, manually. But now, hey, if you're already conversing with the assistant and as you've been going along, it has all that context, you can just tell it, hey, summarize all my findings here, put it in a format where it can be easily consumed by my team, and save it as like an Elastic, we call it a knowledge entry. Save this concept as a knowledge entry so then my team can recall it whenever they need to. So you've put your mind, your thinking process, all your findings in a way which someone can very easily consume the next time something like this happens. So it's much easier for our more senior team to share out this information versus the more time-consuming process of, okay, let me get my favorite Markdown editor, let me start typing all of this out, spend hours formatting it. Like, you don't have to do that anymore. You free up your time to go find the next incident and triage the next thing,
Yeah, exactly. That's a problem that has plagued the SOC for all of time, which, the tribal knowledge, quote unquote, problem. It's like, it's obviously super important to document all those learnings, but it takes forever and no one wants to do it. And it's never really the priority, but ultimately it becomes the priority when you didn't write it down, and then that same problem comes back around. So yeah, having it kind of step in and build that knowledge base for you in the SOC and all your lessons learned in ways that you can document that stuff automatically. That's so cool. This kind of brings me to the next thing I wanted to ask about is like, earlier you mentioned you have this workflow where you look at the alert, you push the button, the thing is there, right? Now we're stepping into agentic workflows and other things where stuff is just happening now, and we don't even need to necessarily push a button or, whatever it is, right? Like things can kind of move somewhat more independently in the background. Where do you see agents coming in as opposed to just traditional like one-off queries or other things like that when it comes to some of the workflows and use cases we've talked about here? Is that creeping into all this as well?
Absolutely. I think so. For those listening who aren't too familiar with this concept of agents, essentially it's the ability for whatever generative AI tool you're using to either take some certain actions on your behalf or run a series of steps for you in the background or user invoked to basically come to a specific outcome instead of you having to ask every single time. Like build a plan, do something, execute it. My friends in Tynes, if you're not familiar, Tynes is the automation workflow company. They have a really good litmus test for when something is called agentic versus not. If you look in an audit log and something was run by a machine, that's how you should probably think of like an agentic action versus if you see a human name in an audit log. So you can think about it that way. It's a really good way to think about it. I think that is going to be, and there already is, like there are many companies implementing this kind of thing. I think it's a really powerful next phase. As long as we understand and put certain boundaries, in my opinion. Again, I'm not a firm believer that there's going to be a fully autonomous SOC. I don't think that's the case. I always think there's going to need to be humans in the loop. But instead of me now having to, let's say start my day, go to an alert, or even start off with attack discovery and then do one thing and then do another, with very explicit instructions beforehand, I can say, look, I'm comfortable with you doing this step and this step and this step. So when I next sign in, for example, you would have done all this work for me as an agent system, right? And then if you have access to multiple tools or third-party tools, that gets even more powerful. Because if you give it the right permission and you need it to retrieve additional context for you to grab an answer. So, we gave an example of CMDB or asset information. Imagine a world where you say, I'm comfortable with you going to retrieve that information for me to grab that answer without me having to ask. You can go ahead and have it do it for you. So there is 100% value in that. I think it's up to us as vendors and people talking about this to make sure we do it in a responsible way and make sure that, especially for any potentially destructive actions, we put some safeguards around it, But it's kind of like the next, I've always been calling it in the back of my head, smart automation. And what I mean by that is, if you consider the world of automation or SOAR, whatever you like to call it as we've known it, what happens? If let's say you need to build a workflow for something to happen automatically when a kind of alert is triggered, right? You have a predetermined set of steps that are going to run, and one thing will follow another, and a bunch of chained events. And you've built that based off of predefined actions. I can go and interact with VirusTotal or my EDR vendor. I've configured them, and now I've chained these certain steps together. It's a very what we call deterministic workflow. And that's kind of how we've been thinking of automation for the last 5, 6, 7 years in the SOC. Where this agentic concept takes it to the next level is, hey, you have these tools, we call them, or actions to go look up VirusTotal or whatever. But now these systems are capable of building their own flows, building their own plan based off of what you've allowed them to have access to. Which means that depending on the situation you're facing, instead of you having to have a hard-coded, very deterministic workflow, they can sort of determine themselves what the right workflow should be based off of the tools that have been provided to them. And that is a very powerful concept, because sometimes we don't know what is even not only do we don't know, we don't have the time necessarily to build the whole workflow and stitch it together. And that is where, in my opinion, it becomes super powerful. Just having the ability to, okay, look, you've provided me with these tools, these actions I could take, these EDR vendors I can interact with, these third-party threat intelligence systems I can go look up. Let me build a plan for you. And here's my agentic workflow to go carry out something when this happens. And that is going to save so much people's time. You know what I mean? It's also going to help with the situation where someone has an automation platform put in front of them. They're like, I can maybe assume what I could build here. I don't necessarily know. And those challenges start to go away. However, and I'm sure you faced this, John, a lot of people think, and this was very true the same time automation platforms came out or whatever, there was this misconception where I'm going to use automation for everything. I'm going to start automating literally every process I have before they even had a manual process to do something. I'm sure you faced that where, I want to automate this. And you ask the customer, are you doing that manually today? Do you have a very documented procedure to do it? Not really. Then there's no way you're going to automate it. And agentic stuff isn't going to take care of that either, just to be really clear. So you still need to be able to know kind of where you want to go with this. It's going to be able to help you suggest things if you don't have that documented, but I still think you need to make sure you know your procedures and have all of that documented and not be taken by surprise with these things. Really important, in my opinion.
If we wanted to paint a picture of how this is going to be different from SOAR, let's talk a specific example here. Very simple, someone gets a phishing email, they click the link, they type in their password, they do their MFA prompt, now their password, their account's been taken over, right? I say the past, but everyone right now, right? The traditional way, you make a SOAR workflow, you make all the buttons you need to push and things, maybe a click away where you could say lock down the account, revoke all the sessions, do this and do that. If someone, whether they were kind of fully in on the agentic AI workflow right now, or maybe just in the near term future, What would the workflow for that situation look as opposed to the traditional quote unquote way that we've been doing it now? What would be different there in the SOC analyst experience?
Yeah, I think the primary difference is that once you've made available things like, hey, here's our connection to go and revoke these sessions or whatever, it can then, based off of like the incident, determine what the right thing to do is versus your very strict step-by-step workflow. Like first do this, wait for an answer, then do this. I think that's going to be the biggest difference because you might not have that workflow yet, but you've made those actions available. And then suggest, look, based off of this type of data, we've identified that, hey, you're using Okta, for example, or using this, or using a tool you have. We've determined that this is going to be the most efficient workflow for you to remediate this incident. Would you like to execute it? And that's going to be the difference because you might not have even built it out yet, but you've maybe configured those tools and maybe you've configured the right credentials and everything, but you just haven't really figured out the right path for these kind of incidents. Agentic systems are going to help you stitch that part together if you haven't stitched it yet. I think that's going to be the primary difference to automation as we know it today.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to think of an analogy in my head here as you're saying that. And the best I could come up with, although it's very much not perfect, is like if you're using a SOAR platform, right? It's like you have a bunch of Legos with all these pieces that you can put together, however, but you have to build them into something.
Correct.
And then that thing is kind of solid, right? It's like you have this workflow that can go from step A to B to C, E, whatever. But that part is locked in. Whereas with agentic, you could say like, here's a bunch of API calls you may decide to make in any given moment. Here's the context. You decide what's connected to what and what API calls are going to be made for this specific situation. And it kind of puts all that together for you, right?
That's perfect analogy. I like the Lego analogy. I might steal it. But no, it's exactly the right way to think about it because maybe your predefined SOAR workflow is a bit too strict, this kind of situation. And what happens today is, we've learned from that. We need to add another if-then-else conditional in our workflow to handle this new thing we hadn't seen before. Whereas with agentic stuff now, because it has all the pieces and it's not like strictly put together, it can actually decide that for you. So that's going to be the biggest advantage here, which means theoretically, people should be able to run this kind of stuff, I don't know if quicker is the right word, more efficiently. So you don't have to have someone theorize what all the workflows might be beforehand and build them out, which, for bigger enterprises, that's a full-time team. Right? They literally hire automation engineers because it's such a time-consuming task to build out all these workflows. Even with no code and stuff, it's still a time-consuming task to think of every situation that might happen to you. Whereas now, this is like the true value of agentic systems where you don't necessarily have to think about everything beforehand. As long as you've configured the right connections, it can help you stitch what the right workflow is in this particular case.
Yeah. And that's the very mind-blowing thing about it. And the next thing I wanted to talk about at some point, which I think this is the perfect segue to, MCP, Model Context Protocol, right? The question being, which I know the answer to, I already said it, how do we make all these things happen, right? What is the actual technical underpinnings of getting an LLM to connect to my firewall and add an IP address, right? The answer being MCP. What are we seeing as of now in terms of capabilities with MCP, and where do you think that's going to go in the middle to longer term future in terms of SOC workflows?
Yeah. So again, maybe for the audience who aren't too familiar with MCP, MCP was a protocol put out a few months ago, like as of the time of this recording, where it stands for Model Context Protocol, where basically a common interface was defined for having large language models interact with third-party tools. It's excellent because now, as a vendor, let's say someone, pick whatever favorite network vendor you are, if they want you to be able to leverage their APIs and functionality with whatever LLM or AI workflow you have, you can just plug in their MCP server, and that's all you need to do. Because now a large language model understands, they can determine what's available via the MCP protocol and execute those actions. We still have a long way to go, in my opinion. I think it was absolutely needed to happen to become a standard. And that's the most important thing that MCP did. It defined a standard for us, just like how we've rallied behind things like the MITRE ATT&CK framework as a standard. This is now a standard for us, which means as vendors, as the people we work with, I'm sure there's going to be a requirement on an RFI somewhere. Do you have an MCP server that we can interact with? That's where it's going to help for sure. Because theoretically, everything was still possible before MCP, it just wasn't standardized. So if, for example, we as Elastic wanted to allow you to use our assistant to go block an IP on a Google Cloud Firewall, whatever, all it meant was that we would have had to build that based off of Google's APIs. But now if they give us an MCP server, we just say, okay, here's the MCP server, we slot it in, and it should be common throughout. So it was possible, just the standard is really going to help accelerate all of this. It's funny because, we've been doing agentic-based stuff with our AI work way before MCP was a thing. But now it just became so popular because of the exposure that MCP got. And in a good way, I think it's all super positive. One thing that is still missing, and I think as soon as this is solved, I think MCP will be everywhere. Things like authentication, authorization, having those common mechanisms, making sure that, hey, if I'm using MCP, does it have a native logging protocol, for example? Because you're absolutely going to want to know what was done when that MCP server was hit, for example. In fact, I think I saw even this week, people are roping in OpenTelemetry into the MCP standard, which is great. So things like that, I think once we work all of this out, identify, hey, did someone just give me an unverified MCP server that is pretending to be, I don't know, a particular tool's API, and then all of a sudden I have a bad actor behind a supposedly MCP server? That is where I think those are the things we need to fix before we fully operationalize MCP. But once we figure it out, I think it's going to benefit absolutely everyone, for sure. And it's going to take us to a point where all these things we've been talking about, especially on agentic workflows, will be super easy for someone to operationalize, both from the vendor perspective, also from the customer's perspective.
Yeah, it's one of those things that, the rare moment where I read about something and my mind is blown with so many ideas all at once, where I'm like, I don't even know where to go with this because there's so many things just opened up here. And I've never seen such a response online to one thing, right? As soon as MCP started to become a thing, that was all I was seeing on social media feeds and Reddit and Twitter and everything else. Just everyone's going crazy about it.
For sure. And I think where you really see how real this is and the effect of adoption is when the primary competitor to the person who created the MCP protocol has adopted it as well. Yeah. So that was fascinating to see versus them saying, oh, we're going to do our own thing that's better. They quickly realized that, the momentum this has gotten, we just should jump on the train and support it versus, trying to fight it. That was amazing to see. And that for me really solidified, okay, this is the future. And then very quickly we saw, complementary protocols to MCP, like Google announced their A2A, their agent-to-agent protocol, which be part of that announcement as Elastic. That's going to be fascinating for me for various reasons, because what A2A is going to allow, for those who aren't familiar, is you can basically it's a common protocol for two agents to communicate with each other. So let's take Elastic's AI assistant, for example, and if you happen to be using some other vendor's AI assistant, or I mentioned Times already, let's say you're using Times Workbench, for example, they can now decide between them, for example, what the next thing to do is, which MCP servers to call on which side. And I think that's just going to be really exciting to see what opportunities that brings, because you might have these systems communicate with each other to determine what the right thing is to do for their users. They know that they have a commonality in what my user's trying to do between two platforms. So let them make certain decisions, again, safe decisions. But think of a world where, again, let's say you live in a world where your security analytics and EDR platforms are disparate, but they have two agents that can communicate over A2A. And imagine they can carry out an investigation between them, between the data that lives in your EDR platform and the data that lives in your SIEM. How fascinating is that? So it's going to open up even more possibilities.
Yeah. Very exciting stuff. It's one of those moments in time where you're like, what this looked like 2 years ago is going to be completely foreign to what this looks like 2 years from now, or maybe even shorter time frame than that, right? It's moving at light speed now with everyone picking these things up. It's just absolutely crazy. You brought up the security issues. People might be hearing this and think, so I can just type in a box like, hey, block this thing on my firewall, pull this data, do this thing, change this or that, and it's just going to be done. How do I lock that down? Are there any standards right now? How are people connecting these, and how is this working for people who maybe have not run into MCP yet?
Yeah, I think right now it's up to the vendor to figure that out. So, we call it the human in the loop challenge, where as a vendor building the stuff for you, and if they're interacting with MCPs, they should be able to identify that, look, the user is potentially asking for something destructive. You should ask them first and authorize that versus just randomly doing it, that's going to be super important. I would never dare operationalize something that doesn't allow that sort of input. But again, right now, I think it's up to the vendor versus the consumer, because consumers are just, they're given a tool. So it's responsibility there. I also think like auditing and logging all these actions is very important. Like, there should never be a world where, you've given a machine the ability to do something and you can't trace that back. So that's going to be really important as well. But ultimately, if there isn't a human in the loop for these things, particularly for these potentially disruptive actions, I think we failed as an industry, and that's where we should definitely be pushed for it. What's nice is we've already seen this happen. We've seen like the vendors working with this technology, they have this requirement and they go back to the people putting out things like MCP or whatever, and quickly either contributing the change or referencing, hey, if you really want wide mass adoption of this, these are kind of the things we're going to need. So we've seen that happen in the past with the generative AI era. Like, classic example, if you use large language models from Amazon and you're using Amazon Bedrock, for example, they added this concept of guardrails. They added guardrails because people were saying, look, I don't want my user to ask about anything. You need to give me some form of mechanism to prevent that. And they're like, yes, very true. So we've seen that happen time and time again. And I think this concept with MCP is the next phase of vendors giving and pitching in what the right direction is. And the reason this is happening a bit in reverse is because of the momentum with AI. It's AI vendors and like Anthropic putting out MCP or whatever, they can't really afford to think everything through because they'll fall behind. And that's kind of the competitive market the AI landscape has become. So the tendency is we'll put out something very early, see what feedback we get, and then we'll adapt as we go. So that's kind of the reason why we're seeing these things come out where they're maybe not fully thought through, but eventually they'll get there. But it's just the nature of the beast. And I'm actually happy with the level of competition that this market has created. What that meant for our users and for us is we saw things like large language models get better, cheaper, and faster. And it's crazy. If you follow, like, you'll see one vendor put out an announcement. A week later, they'll put out an equivalent announcement of a model that they've made equivalently better and cheaper. Yeah. And that's the best thing that could happen in this market right now. Because if there was one vendor doing things the way they wanted to, it would be a full monopoly. Things would be super expensive, very inflexible. And thankfully, that's not what's happened. So I'm really glad it turned out the way it did. Even if sometimes we have to scramble a bit, I think that's okay, as long as people identify that they have to have this concept of responsible AI and scrutinize things before they just blindly adopt them. I think we've been doing the right approach here.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to ask in relation to that is, where do you think this is going to go, maybe in the not too distant future, for where we are running these LLMs? Do you think companies are mostly going to be okay with like, let's use the thing that's online? Are you seeing a lot of companies being like, no, I want all my data processed locally on an LLM that's all here, so that we're definitely not accidentally leaking data or causing any other problems?
Yeah, I still see a lot of the latter. I still see a lot of people concerned about privacy. I can understand why. But what some people fail to realize is, let's say pick whatever vendor you like. Let's say you're using Amazon, Google, whatever, as your cloud provider. You've probably already put all the keys to your kingdom in that cloud provider. Like, you take Microsoft, you probably have all your email, Enter ID.
That's a good point.
Everything. Asking a question about the same alert triggered by the same data and the same environment to the model that's hosted in your Microsoft tenant is not going to be as big as a risk you think, because they already have all that data. There's this misconception that every large language model vendor is training about every single thing you ask it. That is not the case. You obviously be responsible. Make sure the vendor gives you everything you need to be comfortable to understand how they're dealing with your prompts and stuff like that. But for the most part, especially for all the vendors, like cloud provider vendors that have their own models, they aren't doing that. So do your due diligence, of course. Now, and the reason I say that is because people think, oh, it's actually even going to be cheaper for me to run my own model in my own environment. Not only am I going to get the privacy, it's going to be cheaper. It's really not going to be cheaper. The amount of compute you need to run these large language models at the scale that you need them to run, where you're not going to wait 10 minutes for a question to get answered, it's going to be extremely expensive in hardware. if you can even get access to the hardware, because GPUs are so far behind in terms of their production. So the only people or the only organizations where that is warranted is if you have an absolutely hard air-gapped requirement. That's understandable. Like if that really is your use case, their case, sure, host your own model. Thankfully, these days, we see very good open source models that you could run. But if you don't have that requirement, if you don't have that air-gapped requirement, in my very humble opinion, pay the pennies, because it literally ends up being pennies, to pick your favorite allowed vendor who hosts a large language model and use this. That will always be my advice, because it is absolutely not cost effective to run your own model unless you have that really strict air-gapped requirement.
Interesting. Do you think that there is a open source model right now that a company with a large budget could feasibly run that would return the kind of results that would work well in this kind of use case?
Yes, thankfully there are. There's a few choices. In fact, we get asked this question quite often as the vendor. We try to keep up. We publish what we call our large language model performance matrix for both common and open source models. For the open source model, it's a bit harder to keep up because, we do test them, but we need to make sure we have the right machines and access to all the open source models, whatever, before we can do it. Commercial models is easier. Right now, my favorite, this answer might change tomorrow because of how quickly the landscape moves.
Sure.
My favorite models are the latest models from Mistral, the 24B 3.1 Mistral Small, it's called, something like that. It's very knowledge dense. It supports a nice big context window. I think it's about 128K tokens. And we've gotten really good results across the board with that. Obviously, there are others. There are the Quen models, which are really good, in my opinion, as well. Certain flavors of Llama, not all of them. So again, we publish this in our performance matrix. But my very humble opinion, the right balance between accuracy and performance right now is that Mistral model. But again, my answer might change tomorrow, just because of how quickly this moves. I'm not even sure I'm familiar with all of them. I'll be 100% honest with you. I track the most common vendors. Again, people like Llama, Mistral, Quen. I've obviously tried DeepSeek and a few others. But right now, Mistral is the clear winner at this point in time, in my opinion.
Okay. And for listeners that are wondering, we are recording this on May 9th, 2025. So if you're wondering what date right now is, that's the context there. A different question I wanted to ask related to something you previously said as well. The comment on needing humans in the loop, right? That's one thing. That's one clear danger. It's been a danger with SOAR platforms as well, right? We've always had to say, like, don't just go and block whatever you want. As cool as that would be when it works, it becomes a fast disaster when it doesn't work, right? The other danger in a lot of people's minds is hallucinations, right? The more we learn to rely on LLMs and the more we probably let the part of our mind atrophy that can do it the hard way, the more we're probably going to say like, yeah, it's probably right most of the time, right? How do we know and how do we become confident with the answers that are coming out and that they're right? Have you seen hallucinations cause any disasters? Where do you see them? Just any kind of thoughts around that problem?
For sure. Probably the most common question I get asked. So thankfully, I haven't seen hallucinations cause a disaster because we haven't, at least from our side, because we haven't built in anything where a hallucination might do something destructive. I'll tell you how we've been thinking about hallucinations from the start. So they are real, by the way. And just like false positives, if you have a vendor telling you they can guarantee 100% no hallucinations, they're just downright lying, right? So that's the same concept we apply to the 100% no false positives. I'm just calling that's never going to be a thing. Now, there are ways to tackle it. First of all, thankfully, what we've seen is these models over time, because of the data they're being given to train, have been hallucinating much less. Also, when you apply the additional context from your environments, when you apply that RAG technique or whatever, you are grounding a large language model in truth, because what it's going to be able to answer, the text it's going to be able to generate, this is a generative model, is grounded in a deep source of truth. And this is true for alerts and it's true for other things. Like even just providing one alert as a source of truth is going to help it not completely make something up. So it will always help. Another thing to consider, and where we see models hallucinate, the prompt makes a huge difference in terms of even how you formulate your question. There's a tendency to be very polite with large language models. Like, you are a helpful assistant doing this and this and this. You've just told the model to be helpful. So its first thing it's thinking about when generating text is, I have to be helpful no matter what.
Yeah.
Which means if it doesn't know the answer, it's going to be helpful and answer you with something completely made up. So even things like that, it's fascinating to see the difference one term could make. Because, without the right context and without the right positioning, it's not going to be necessarily a wrong answer. It's just it didn't have the right context for you to give the right answer. But it just generated text based on what it assumed could be right. And that's what a hallucination is. It generated text because of the assumption it made of what could be right in its corpus of trained data. So that's how we've been targeting it, and I say tackling it. Very specific system prompts grounded in truth, with either RAG that we're doing in the background or context that it's getting from what we're using, whether it's alerts or events or whatever that might be. When we do that, you almost get like the percentage of, like, maybe you get one hallucination in 100 prompts, quite literally. But we didn't speak about this in terms of the agentic steps, but where agents help is they can correct potential hallucinations. So like in our attack discovery feature that I was talking about earlier, we have an agent in there that looks for hallucinations. And if we identify that the result we're giving you is hallucinated, we tell you. We don't tell you, trust this result. We tell you, look, we've identified that we've tried 5 times. Every time we got a hallucinated output, you might need to try again, try a different model, whatever. So even like, we be upfront if we identify a hallucination, and it works very well. And there's also now this concept, it's not new, but we actually use it in our internal evaluation tools because we built a whole evaluation framework for this tooling. But there's this concept of LLM as a judge, where you have one large language model generate the first response and another judge the first response. So like, and then it can identify, actually, this, answer that was generated doesn't look right based off of like a corpus of training data that I have. So that's where agents become really useful, because you can build that with agentic frameworks like we've done. So it's still will always be a concern, because again, I want to be a responsible vendor and never tell you that it's never going to happen. But with all these technologies that we have, and with these models getting better, and the ability to ground models in truth, the risk is extremely low these days.
Yeah, that's just so cool that kind of stuff is even possible. Like we're using AI on the AI to tell us if the AI is wrong. It just sounds like absolute like futurism at this point, but it's actually here, and it's just still mind blowing every day to me that this kind of stuff is possible. Another thing I wanted to ask, and I don't know if this is something your specialty is in or not, but any opinion on how AI, or how you've seen AI helping attackers?
Oh, I guarantee that it's being used by attackers. And for the same reasons we use it as defenders. It allows them to be more efficient. It allows them to craft, let's take phishing campaigns, probably the biggest use we've seen. The challenge that we've been trained as a security industry that you identify a phishing email because it has bad grammar or things don't look right. You know what generates good grammar? Large language models. You know what generates good HTML to make an email look super professional? Large language models. So those kind of traditional quirks that we might have seen go away. But even making things repetible. I can get, we all know attackers leverage cloud and Terraform to spin up attacking infrastructure, whatever. You know what an attacker doesn't want to have to stay doing? Writing a Terraform provider. But they can now use LLMs to do it. And, there have been, unfortunately, like open source models that have been trained and jailbroken to generate malware and that sort of thing. So absolutely, these things are happening. But this is true for pick whatever technology that we have that we leverage as defenders. Attackers are going to use it and abuse it in the same way. And large language models are no different. We did publish, if anyone's interested, we published in our global threat report some of these findings as well, what we see on our side from our security labs team, which is the research arm of Elastic. So we'll put that link as well. And there's some really fascinating findings there. But yeah, it's real. It's definitely being used. I can absolutely guarantee it.
Are defenders going to be more helped, or are attackers going to be more helped by
the core difference between attackers and defenders is attackers don't have any red tape or protocols that they follow, whereas blue teamers, we do, right? We are constrained by the models potentially we're allowed to use. We're constrained where and what data my organization lets me put into them. So If you have a lot of red tape in your organization and you're very restricted about how you can use these models, then attackers might be more successful than you used to use them. I think if you don't have that, like if you're smart with models and you know how to use them and leverage them, I think it's like a 50-50 split about who would be successful. But if you've been given so much red tape or too many policies to use them, attackers don't have that, and they'll just do whatever they need to do with them.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'll inject my take on that. I think a lot of security operations is reliant on speed, and speed was reliant on manpower in a lot of cases, right? And kind of this whole discussion has centered around how this can further automate a lot of things that were not automatable in the very recent past. So my hope is based on that, the attackers, yes, they will be able to spin up infrastructure and do other stuff faster, but we'll be able to rip through the tickets faster,
100%.
get their context, chase them faster. And I'm hoping that will turn the tide in our favor. Last question. Where do you think the SOC of the maybe 5 to 10 year future is going to be? And let me throw in a little more detail on that question. We hear a lot about vibe coding, right? And things like that now, where you just kind of sit back and let the AI do its thing. And it's very, very hands off, not a whole lot of deep technical thought. Do you picture a world where maybe in 5 years we're all vibe defending or sitting around just like talking to our computers and saying like, do this, do that, and like the technical skills that are relevant now largely go away? Or do you think there are certain things that are going to stay true about what people need to know for, you know, SOC related technical skills and things like that will be everlasting?
What a phenomenal question. I think the core thing that's going to change in 5-10 years is, I think, the concept of defaulting to something like a query for detection or a hunt is going to go away. I think it's natural language now. And I think as vendors, like if we don't think about that now, we're going to miss out. So my hope, my genuine hope is that in 5-10 years, the life of a cybersecurity analyst is going to be so much easier. And we'll reduce the burden someone coming out of college, you know, they're put in front of an elastic security and they have to figure it out from scratch. What my dream is that they just sit down and like either they're told exactly what they need to do next, or they can ask in natural language, in whatever language they prefer. And it just makes their life so much easier, and they're able to spend time on what they prefer doing and doing more interesting things. I think that's the SOC of the future. I still think you need to know the theoretical things. I still need to, like, you shouldn't not know, for example, what a specific technique is or whatever, but it's going to be quicker for you to learn what that is. Because now you don't have to sift through 10,000 articles on the topic. You can just ask about it. Or you can like build me a training class based off of this content from this vendor or whatever, or simulate an attack for me. Like, you know, that's going to be, even for, both for the consumer, but also the vendor and, you know, John, like your work with SANS or whatever, that's going to be much, much more interesting because now you can do this sort of stuff and provide these sort of things. So that's where I think in 5-10 years, my hope, at least my hope, is where we'll be, where we take away a lot of the traditional SOC out of the security operations, right? Like it should be a career goal where it is now a fun thing to do, versus crap, I just started using this product, I have to spend a month learning their query syntax. Yeah. Hopefully all of that goes away. That's my wish and my hope.
Yeah. My brain kind of followed the path as soon as I saw MCP, like I said, to a world where I'm like, is cybersecurity just going to be like conversing with an LLM? Like, do I even need a UI at some point? Like where I can have everything just told, like, am I going to be having a conversation as a SOC analyst and that's it? Because like, we're pretty much to the world where if you hooked everything up, like we could do that right now if you really wanted to. And we're not quite ready to do that reliably yet. But like, this is the worst the tech is ever going to be. So how much do we abstract this away?
I love using that phrase of this is literally the worst it's going to be. Because it is so true. And from my perspective, as someone designing and building products, I can never plan more than 6 months in advance because I know what I can do today is going to change. What I can do in 6 months, or my teams are going to be able to build in 6 months. So it becomes much trickier, but honestly, it is genuinely so exciting. Another part which makes this really exciting, and where I think that vision of 5 to 10 years from now is an actual reality, this is the first technology we're leveraging really heavily in security operations, which is not only funded by cybersecurity companies, if that makes sense. If you think about the traditional like machine learning methods or technologies like UEBA or whatever, that was driven by a need or mostly a need for what cyber teams need to do. Yes, we would use very common techniques for supervised malware detection, whatever. But this is now a technology which is so well funded that the gaps for what it could do close significantly faster than what we're used to. And unless I'm forgetting some technology, we've never had anything like that, where we don't necessarily have to rely on only what cyber vendors need or data scientists need to actually get it fixed or whatever. This is now in the eye of the world, and it's almost funded by the world if you think about it. Like there's so much money being thrown at this that it just gets better at a much more dramatic rate than we're used to.
Yeah, great point. Exciting stuff. It's going to be a brave new world in the SOC in a very short amount of time. So thank you, James, so much for all these gems, ideas, explanations of all this stuff, and some picture of the future and where we're going.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, John. It's been a blast.
Yes, thank you. Well, if that conversation didn't hype you up for the future of the SOC, I don't know what will. We're in a time of rates of change we've never seen before, which, yes, is scary and brings risks with it, but also brings incredible opportunities across the board. If you haven't already started to play with AI, agents, coding assistants, and more, seriously, now is the time. And now is also the time to find yourself a reliable source on getting updates, since what's not possible today may quickly become possible tomorrow. I hope this conversation energized you as much as it did for me, but what should you do with that energy? Well, I suggest next time you head to work, throughout the entire day, invite AI to the table for almost any task you do, and ask yourself, could AI make this faster, better, or easier? And how would I make that happen? If you have an idea but aren't sure if it's possible, hey, you can always ask an LLM that too. You might be surprised what it comes up with. All right, that's what I've got for you for this episode. Don't forget to check the links in the show notes, and once again, thanks for listening to Blueprint.